Hey, good morning, everyone. My name is Matt Kozloski. I'm the VP of Professional Services and Cybersecurity for the Winslow Technology Group. We're joined this morning with Josh Stenhouse, a Field CTO at Rubrik, one of our really great partners for backup data and information protection. A lot of really cool stuff that Josh is going to share with us this morning. I'd love to do like a poll or something like that. This is more of a webinar format, so we can't. But I hope everyone got the coffee beanery kit this morning. I brewed the cherry version of the coffee, where it fits one whole bag fits perfectly with 6 cups of water in the coffee maker. So that was perfect this morning. Looking forward to sampling the rest. I'll probably date myself a little bit, but I was surprised that the coffee beanery was still around. I remember going there in the malls like in the 90s. So anyway, cool surprise, a little nostalgic, and I hope everyone was able to brew and enjoy a really nice cup of coffee this morning. So I am, again, from the Winslow Technology Group, and we are here again this morning with Rubrik. So we're just do a little bit of an introduction in terms of Winslow Technology Group, Rubrik, and I'm going to turn it over to Josh Stenhouse to talk a bit about zero trust strategies, specifically with data protection, recovery, and the whole, kind of like ransomware world, data immutability world that we live in. And, we'll leave a little time for Q&A and wrap up towards the end. So if you'd like, feel free to freshen your cup of coffee. Hope you can enjoy one with us, and we'll go from there. So I am, again, from the Winslow Technology Group. We are a leader of IT solutions. We provide managed services and certainly an entire portfolio of cybersecurity products and services, which, very much commingles with our data center business that we've been historically known for. So whether it's data center infrastructure, so cloud, on-premise environment, hybrid work environments, things of that nature. We're a go-to partner for that, whether it's data protection or hosting, cloud strategies, whether that's public, private, hybrid, including SaaS, so your Microsoft 365, your Azure, your AWS, things of that nature. We're glad to help you out with that. We have a full suite of end-user compute that includes security and services. So if you have like a Dell laptop or Lenovo laptop or something like that, and a little help securing that device, we're happy to provide solutions to lock those endpoints down, provide like EDR, MDR type services, and of course backup and data protection. And then we have a full suite of professional and co-managed services. So professional services, especially for cybersecurity, include penetration testing, vulnerability assessments, purple team activities, tabletop exercises, things of that nature. And if you're struggling with keeping things patched, keeping your environment maintained, and then also moving your company in a strategic technology direction, that's exactly where our North Star co-managed services help you out. So we're glad to help you from basically like desktop to data center to cloud and beyond with that. And we also have Winslow Financial Services. So if you need a way to lease or fund this, or turn a capital expense into an operating expense, we're more than happy to do that as well. So that's a little bit about the Winslow Technology Group. I am going to turn it over to Josh to introduce himself, introduce Rubrik, and tell us a little bit about backup and data protection done the Rubrik and WTG way.
All right, let's take it away. Thank you, Matt. Okay. So, as a quick intro, Joshua Stenhouse, I'm the Field CTO for Cyber Resilience at Rubrik, and today I've been a part of over 100 ransomware attacks and the subsequent recovery, and Rubrik has a 100% success rate. So I'm going to talk about how that's possible, but also the lessons learned from that and the common traps that I see people fall down in, where you're going to lose the most time. So it's going to give you a good idea of everything you're going to need to know, because one thing I can definitely be sure of is that the learning curve is off the charts. So the basic premise here is that everybody's got backup, but just because you got backup doesn't mean that you've got cyber resilience, because a key problem that everybody has is knowing, well, even if the backups are survivable from the attack, how do I know what to recover from what backups and when? And that is usually the biggest difference between being able to recover in a matter of hours, maximum a few days, or weeks to months, which you see quite commonly. So that before we start talking about backups, it's important to level set on, well, what is the key problem that we're designing for here? Well, everybody has this question of, can I recover? And everybody has multiple layers of defense. Now, it would be pure folly to think, well, I've got multiple layers of defense and they didn't, because everybody has these layers. And yet attackers are still able to get in. And if they get in, then we know, well, as soon as they bypass all those layers of defense, then they've got access to the applications and data. And the best case scenario is that they just exfiltrate data. But usually they're going to exfiltrate and then they're going to encrypt. And you might say, well, I don't have any routes in, I'm good. Well, if you look at the most common routes in, the first one's pretty easy, and you see this all the time, is VPNs. And you might say, well, that's for people who don't put MFA on the VPN. Yeah, that will make it very easy. But even if you have MFA, as an attacker, they're increasingly hijacking that session. They're going for the end user at home, and then all the MFA hasn't stopped them getting on that network because the user let them in as they logged in. We also see RDP, pretty common. So any open RDP should be shut down. That's a pretty easy one. But then the other route is anything that you have in terms of VDI. So all the major VDI vendors, again, token hijacking, social engineering. If you have VDI open, then they're going to get in. And then the last one is critical infrastructure or exchange being presented on premises to the cloud. And I'll put critical infrastructure. Like people will take backup servers or vCenters or put those on the cloud. And then between one of those, if you got any of them, then you got a potential route in. And so what's next fair to say is then, okay, I have to assume breach. So if the attacker does get on this network, what are they going to do? The first thing is they're going to establish persistence. Now, one thing on persistence, they usually only use a handful of servers. So in my experience, it's around 3 to 5 servers for persistence, and they're typically non-prod IT infrastructure related, where nobody is looking at them that closely. Establish persistence. What they don't do is immediately load any malware, because that is the end of the kill chain. That's what you're looking for. They're just lightly establishing persistence, doing reconnaissance, traversing the network. And next is they're going to exfiltrate anything accessible as part of a double extortion. Pretty common in every attack. Say, I have your data and I'm going to release it unless you pay anyway. Then they're going to come for your backups and snapshots. And this is a fundamental shift in the approach to backup and data protection, because these technologies weren't traditionally designed with this attack in mind. And then finally, they encrypt the data and leave a ransom. So there's a tendency when assuming breach to say, well, all I got to do is protect my backup data. And certainly that is the first most important thing you need to do. And this is where terms like immutability, air gapping, everything comes into play. Now, yes, you need an air gap. Yes, you need immutability. Yes, you need a retention lock to make sure it can't be prematurely expired. And if you don't already have these, you need them yesterday. You have to presume that those backups are not going to be there. But what we can tell you, Rubrik, is that we've had these controls at number one since day one, now 7 years, 100 plus attacks. And what we can tell you is that your downtime and your impact is still going to be measured in weeks and millions if that's all you have. Because the next problem statement is, well, my endpoint protection has failed. It's either been bypassed or they've encrypted from a location that didn't have endpoint protection in the first place. This is the next interesting fact for you. 60% of attacks in the last 6 months, the attacker is now encrypting from the hypervisor. Why? Because it's fast and you have no EDR running there typically, especially if it's ESXi. I can encrypt at will. The third problem, data is exfiltrated. How do I know what sensitive data is at risk? You might say, well, this is why I invest in some DLP tooling. Yes, you should have DLP tooling. Fantastic at stopping an employee leaving with a spreadsheet, but it has no power over an attacker on a network, not even network scanning. because they have a persistent encrypted backdoor they can siphon at will. So number 3 is an interesting problem, because then you have to presume, well, everything on the network was potentially stolen. So what was on the network? It's too late to ask after the fact. Data's already encrypted. So that has a serious implication on the time it takes you to then understand what sensitive data was at risk, and then any associated reporting requirements of those breaches. 4th problem, how do you identify a clean recovery point and not reintroduce the attacker? If you think about, hey, I've got backups, but now I need to find out which ones the attacker's in, what is that process going to be? How long is it going to take me to figure that out before I can even consider the prospect of recovering to production? This is where you're usually going to lose the days and the millions, if not sometimes weeks. And then 5, once you made that decision, how do you automate it and test it? And prove that you can do this in advance, that you have the ability to recover from a cyber attack. So that's the final challenge everyone has, is how do I prove that I can recover? And not just a data recovery, anyone can recover data. An actual cyber recovery where we assume breach, and now we have to find out what is or isn't compromised and what is a clean recovery point. It's always not bad. There's a reason why I'm talking about this. And it's of course because there is a way to become cyber resilient. And the first thing is you've got to approach your data protection with zero trust principles. And I know zero trust is an often overused term, but if I was going to pick 2 areas in any environment where you apply zero trust principles, 1 be perimeter, and 2 it would be your backup platform. Everything else in between, yes, do it, but those are the 2 most important. Because 1, try and stop them getting in. 2, there's always many way around privilege escalation once they're in. 3, if all else fails, you're going to need to go to backup. So you got to make sure those backups, you have a local recovery capability to that data set. You got to make sure you're protecting everything on-prem, cloud, and SaaS. You have built-in MFA, because your directory service is likely going to be compromised, so it needs its own built-in MFA and user capability. And then you got to make sure that the backups are air-gapped, immutable, and retention locked. And this is, of course, exactly what Rubrik does for you. So this is a key capability of Rubrik, that no matter where your data lives, we're going to protect it. And we're going to give you a local recovery, disaster recovery, etc. But that's only problem statement number 1. Because then the next problem statement is, well, the attacker has encrypted the data. How do I know what was encrypted? And there's a tendency here to say, okay, then we're going to look for anomalies in the backup streams. And the problem with anomaly detection is that, quite honestly, it's absolutely useless. Because all an anomaly says is, hey, a larger than normal amount of data changed. So all you're going to get is false positives and noise. No use to anybody. But even worse is that in the event of an attack, it's still just saying anomaly, anomaly, anomaly. It's not even telling you what was encrypted. So the next thing you got to make sure is that you've got built-in encryption detection. So at Rubrik, this is what we do. We have built-in encryption detection. And what this means is that we're not just going to see an anomaly and flag it. We're actually going to analyze it. And we have 2 machine learning models in play here. So the first ML model is looking at a change rate per server. And that's important because if you're using some sort of global default, well, 5% change rate works for one, doesn't work for another. Neither can you trust a user to do this better than a machine. So the first model per workload, second backup onwards, looking at the change rate. Any deviation on that change rate, then it kicks it down to a second ML model, and that is then pre-trained, and it is doing a diff against the previous backup. And that diff then says, okay, what actually changed here? Is this just Joe Blog deleting 100,000 files? Or I'm actually seeing a full or partial randomized encryption attack? Now it does it. Any new file or any file modified, it scans inside it, looks at its entropy and randomization, and it'll say, hey, I just detected an attack. These are the 1,000 servers, could be physical, VMs, shares. And by the way, these are the 100,000 files that I just saw encrypted. So this immediately then gives you a baseline of, okay, this is the minimum that we're going to have to recover. And also, this is the minimum that we have to presume is likely exfiltrated, because if an attacker could encrypt a file, they most definitely had the ability to access it. So this, in combination with everything on that network, you now have to presume is exfiltrated. So then the next question you need to be able to answer is, well, what sensitive data was in the backups? Because whatever's in the backups is an accurate reflection of them on the network. And the reason I say you have to do it in the backups is, well, you can't scan production at this point. It's encrypted. Your backup is immutable, hopefully, so that's the only thing that is available. And by scanning in the backups, which is exactly what Rubrik does, we can tell you these are the sensitive files on the network, link it to what was encrypted, so you understand the risk posture of the minimum that was exfiltrated. And this is then going to tell you, hey, this is what we believe is a minimum that was stolen. And this is not just after the fact. The biggest value of this is actually using it proactively. So a lot of Rubrik customers use our built-in sensitive data discovery to proactively scan and then mitigate the risk in the first place. And while it's fair to say, hey, even if you've got existing data classification tooling today, great, keep using it. Many different use cases for it. But it's usually only licensed per agent. You're probably scanning the top 20 to 40% of an environment. So the big extra reason why backup is that, yeah, you got to back it up to scan it, but that is most likely going to be the closest to 100% coverage across your network. And you're not just looking at the places you know to look, you're looking everywhere else. So you're looking for the data leakage. Common one that I see in ransomware attacks, especially from organizations that are heavy on M&A, is data being exposed from M&A mergers and migrations and workloads that you didn't even know had sensitive data, and especially in the dev test environments with data loading and transformation, that if you're just looking in production, the attacker might have access to a trove of sensitive information, and it was everything outside of prod that you're not looking at. So by doing sensitive data discovery in the backups, it gives you that 100% coverage, the leakage, and the ability to use this proactively. And at Rubrik, ours, we have 60 plus analyzers for all the common data types. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel, but you can also put your own custom pattern and regex scanners on top. And because it runs from the backups, absolutely no production impact. So you can ask big questions, and yeah, the first scan of a few billion files will take a few days. But then the second scan, well, only 2% has changed, so it doesn't need to scan everything. So it starts to get very fast at being able to be being used proactive. Now, the next problem that you're going to have is, well, okay, I understand the blast radius, I understand my sensitive data, but now I need to start recovering my operating systems. Now, for anything with an operating system, how do you know what is or isn't compromised? How do you know the zombies versus the victims? And there's a tendency in the fog of war here to think, well, if I can't tell the difference, I have to treat everything like a zombie and roll everything back. So now, first problem is, okay, we've got a serious amount of data loss to consider. And then the second problem is, well, how am I going to make that determination on that recovery point? What is the process and how long is it going to take? And I can tell you it's usually multiple recoveries of systems, isolation of that system, then load a scanner, scan, wait, rinse and repeat. And so the process of finding a clean recovery point and backups is where you're going to lose the days and the weeks and the millions. So the next thing you got to make sure is that you have the ability to scan those backups, to perform threat hunting inside them, scan for IOCs, to quickly identify clean recovery point. And then furthermore, for every compromised recovery point, make sure it's quarantined so that when you're then driving the recovery, you're not reintroducing the attacker. So this is a capability unique to Rubrik, because we're not just saying, hey, we can scan the backups. We have the ability to scan for our own intelligence. So we layer in Rubrik intelligence of the latest gangs and their tooling. You can also put in your own. And that could be programmatically or ad hoc in a recovery, and we accept them in the form of YAR rules, files, paths, and extensions and hashes. YAR rules and hashes are the two most common, so that you can then put in and say, okay, yes, we're going to proactively scan, but we're still looking for the known knowns. We also need to presume that we're not going to see it in advance. And if we do, then make sure that we can then put in our own intelligence via our security teams, via incident response to say, okay, look for this gang, look for this tooling, and quickly tell me what is a clean recovery point per server. If you don't have this capability inside your backups, guarantee you're going to be recovering a lot of them, waiting for each recovery, scanning each recovery, rinse and repeating. And this is where you lose the time because you might not even have a place to do that. If you think about achieving an isolated copy of your entire production environment, how big is that compute going to be? Is the compute and the infrastructure and the services associated even going to be available to bring it online? If not, then you've got to factor in building all of that into your recovery time before you can even then bring on workloads to do a scan. So number 4 is your biggest shortcut in all of this, because you're not having to build an isolated environment just to scan and ensure you're not reinfecting. You're not having to do anything in terms of bringing a workload online to scan. Easy answer, scan it in its offline state to then determine the clean recovery point. But the other key thing that this allows is that if you think about the data loss. So I'll give you an example from a recent ransomware attack that I was a part of the response team on. This environment, not the biggest in the world, but they had around 500 servers that were impacted. Now, again, if you think about that fog of war, if you don't know which of the 500 servers are zombies, you have to treat them all. We're going to try and roll the entire environment back 5 days. But what we showed them with the built-in threat hunting is actually of the 500 servers, there were only 5 of them were zombies. And those 5 that were zombies, the last clean recovery point was 6 days ago. And typical dwell time of a ransomware attacker, according to M-Trends, is 5 days. In the last year, that's exactly what we've seen in over 100 responses. Anyone quoting hundreds of days, it's old figures, it's not related to a ransomware attack. If they're encrypting data, median dwell time 5 days. And that's typically what we see, and it's what we saw in this response. But then interestingly is, well, what that meant in terms of the rest of the environment. Because if we could tell you the zombies, then that means we can also tell you what is a victim. And the victim it does not contain the attacker, doesn't contain the malware, the remote access tools. So what it meant for this particular customer is the other 495 servers, you don't have to roll them back 6 days. They recovered them to yesterday. So now you're not just clearing that fog of war, you're also minimizing the data loss. And because you can pick a clean recovery point per server, you don't have to do these broad strokes and treat everything the same. But then finally, once you've made that decision on a clean recovery point, quarantine the known bad, then you've got to be able to make sure that you can prove and automate an actual cyber recovery. At Rubrik, this is built in. It's not a licensed extra that is a separate module. Built-in cyber recovery, pre-build or do ad hoc cyber recovery planning, testing, war games, simulations, and then produce the reporting attestation that, hey, we didn't just implement this, we also tested it. This is the RTO, and this is the result. And it's pretty common for this now to be a requirement of either maintaining or achieving any cyber insurance, is to not just say that we have a plan, but also produce the attestation that you've tested your plan and you have the ability to recover. And that's why it's got to be baked in as part of this workflow. Otherwise, you've done everything, and then at the end, now you don't even have the ability to prove that you can do it. So you've got to make sure that you have this built in. But this is just the technology. So the other key problem that we have to solve for is, well, what about my people? Because my people have never been through a ransomware attack, and the learning curve is off the charts. So the next thing you got to make sure is that you have somebody to call that's going to help you drive the actual recovery itself. And so at Rubrik, we're not just giving you these technologies and running for the hills and saying good luck. For every single Rubrik customer, if you're using us for data protection, then you gain all of these capabilities, and you also gain on retainer our ransomware response team. So this is the team that I work with. Call Rubrik support, say you've been attacked. Unfortunately, yes, you already have to be a Rubrik customer for data protection in order to call this group. Otherwise, there's not going to be anything to recover. Probably going to call them on a weekend. It's usually Friday night, Saturday morning, the majority of attacks still. And this is the team that have done over 100 ransomware recoveries from customers' Rubrik backups. And the best way to think about them is a bridge between data protection, security, and IR. Does it replace any of these? No. It augments and connects all of them together because they're all going to work together in order to drive a successful and speedy recovery. And they will stay with you until you no longer need them. This is a big differentiator. I'd argue you could justify the cost of using Rubrik for data protection on this alone, but we also, with Wilmso, can help you build out a TCO of, hey, this is not going to cost you the earth. This is going to just replace your existing data protection technologies, give you the ability to then layer on all of these cyber capabilities, and it's not going to cost you anything more. In fact, it's probably going to be cost equal depending on what your current technologies are, and that's something that we can all work on together to make sure that you have the justification of how do I get access to these technologies and how do I get access to this ransomware response team if I need to use them all in an attack. And with that, closing slide, don't back up, go forward. I think we've got a few minutes here for any potential questions, so let's take it away. Matt, you seen any questions come in?
I do. Great job there. Thank you so much for that. So one of the questions we had come in is, you mentioned that you all responded to several attacks. And you have that awesome incident response service with, in addition to all the, backup and data protection. What would you say are some of the more common routes that an attacker takes to get into people's environment? Early in the presentation, you mentioned like RDP, obviously phishing, like anything like unusual. That's one of the questions that came in.
Yeah, it's unfortunately, as I said, it's VPNs and VDI are the top two. That
okay,
and even with MFA, that you've got to look at, well, who's connecting in via the MFA and from what. So for example, if you have BYOD and then they VPN in and that VPN has MFA, well, if I've compromised their home machine, then I just got on that network and you had a VPN with MFA. You might have had the best VPN in the world. Doesn't matter. I'm on that network. So any route in, you have to presume as potentially compromisable. And then if they get in, then where can they go from that? And that's usually where you'll see one big differentiator of the big banks is that they have the network isolation where even if you got in, you still can't go anywhere else. Whereas on the smaller side, there's more flat networks and they have the ability to traverse.
Just for, the attendees' awareness too, like when you talk about MFA, we've seen and have assisted on incident response and hardening. MFA fatigue is a real thing. So even if you have MFA, I'll say properly implemented on VPN, VDI, your M365 or, Google Workspace, whatever, know that MFA fatigue is a real thing and users are just tapping accept because they don't know. And that's a real thing too. So having, MFA is great, but Josh, to your point, having a way to detect and recover from an incident is like really, really critical. Even if you think you're doing everything right with MFA to protect VPN and VDI and have everything patched. So we are just at the top of the hour here. There were a couple more questions. So what we'll do is we'll follow up afterwards with the email. Josh, I really want to thank you very much for joining us today. We do offer a cyber recovery assessment. It is like a basic, cyber recovery, disaster recovery assessment where we talk a little bit about planning, prevention, technology, execution. We're happy to conduct this at no charge, no cost. So certainly follow up with us at webinars@winslowtg.com, and we're more than happy to conduct that for you. And with that, I'll say thank you very much for everyone who's attended. Josh, thank you very much for everything you talked about today, and really appreciate you and the Rubrik partnership. And I hope everyone enjoyed their coffee and continues to enjoy the 9 or so samples that came in the kit. So thank you very much, everyone. Have a really great day.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks all.